Welcome to the first episode in our Destination Rural podcast, Series 2. I'm Peter Rutherford. I'm the CEO of the Rural Doctors Association of Australia. We kick off this series talking to Dr. Lachlan McIver, a rural generalist whose career has taken him all over the world and on many adventures. Grab a coffee or a cup of tea, sit back, relax and enjoy. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet on and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Lachlan McIver from Geneva. So a different experience on this podcast episode. Dr. McIver will be talking to us from Geneva. Hey, Lachlan, how are you going?
I'm tip-top, Peter. It's an absolute pleasure to be chatting with you, particularly on such a auspicious platform like the podcast.
Thank you. We'll get right into it. We're really keen just to hear a little bit about your background and your journey and have a fairly fluid conversation. But yeah, just really keen to sort of hear your story and how you've ended up in Geneva. But we'll get to that sort of later on as we go through. But where did you grow up?
I am born and bred in Milla in far north Queensland. It's on the Tablelands. Some would call it the Atherton Tablelands, but they're mostly folks from Atherton, so don't give them too much credit. It's a beautiful little town. There's kind of a blink and you miss it town on the Palmerston Highway. Population is about 300, last I checked, mostly my extended family. And it's historically it's dairy farming country. So the Milla Milk Run, then Malanda Milk Run was the world's longest milk run for a while. And I grew up on a small beef cattle property. We were in an island of beef in an ocean of dairy, mainly because the property, well, two reasons. One was that my father was a teacher. He was a special ed teacher. So he worked full time. My mum was a midwife. And so our farm was a part-time concern, large hobby farm, you could say, 160 acres, sort of 60, 70 head. But that meant it was a very busy part-time affair, so used all our weekends and holidays. And yeah, I grew up there, spent all my life there. The property itself has historical significance. We can go down a little rabbit hole about that. But it's sort of very, very beautiful, isolated property encircled by rainforest. Was once home to a couple of hundred people on a commune run by an eccentric Swedish chiropractor. But yeah, after being born in Cairns Hospital, I spent the first 17 years of my life on that farm outside Milla until I packed my two suitcases and moved to Melbourne to start medical school.
So did you just go to school locally or in Atherton or?
Milla had and still has a primary school, but the school bus didn't go up our dirt road. And with Dad being a teacher, it was more practical and feasible for my sister and I to ride with him. So yeah, he was the teacher in charge of the special ed unit in Atherton. And so I went to primary school in Atherton. And then Dad got the principal job of the special school in Innisfail. So we went to high school in Innisfail. So okay. A lot of traveling, a lot of time in the car.
And so why rural medicine? I mean, obviously you moved to Melbourne. Is that what you said? You moved to Melbourne for medical school. But was there a commitment for rural medicine before university, or what was the drive that led you to rural medicine?
I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with my life, Peter, when I was in high school. But I guess medicine was in the mix. I didn't really know what that would involve. I didn't know any doctors. I mean, Dad had one friend who was a doctor, and we went water skiing with him and his family from time to time. But yeah, I'm from essentially a non-medical family. Or at least until my younger cousin jumped on the medical bandwagon. So yeah, I didn't really have any medical sort of role models growing up, but had this vague sense that being a doctor might be something I might want to do or like to do. My parents were totally relaxed about whatever I chose to do with my life and career, and I was interested in sciences. And I guess in their own subtle way, my dad being not only a teacher, but, special education teacher and, spoke sign language and was often tinkering in the garage, sort of doing modifications for wheelchairs for his pupils with cerebral palsy and this kind of thing. So he was someone who cared for people, particularly, those less fortunate. And mum too, as a midwife, she'd done a lot of her training in Indigenous communities and rural parts of Australia. And she's a very compassionate person, my mum. So in their own ways, they sort of demonstrated to my sister and me what it meant to consider others and be compassionate and help people in a general sense. And so I guess subconsciously, as I progressed through high school, that instinct, that training, that role modeling probably helped narrow down my options. But quite frankly, the thing that really triggered the decision-making cascade was when I found Dad dead on the side of our dirt road when he was 49 and I was 16. And that just turned our lives upside down. And it also came at a time when I was about to finish high school and needed to make some decisions. And so I guess having experienced that horrendous life-changing trauma and with that, the sort of sense of outrage or even just actual rage that, how could this happen? This is so unfair. Shouldn't be like this. That definitely nudged me closer to saying, okay, not only medicine, but in my mind, the term didn't even exist, but something like rural medicine, rural generalist medicine. And then more practical factors too, like, we didn't have much money. Monash offered me a scholarship. Off I went.
Oh, okay. So the family stayed in North Queensland and you went to Melbourne on your own, or?
It did, yeah. We had to sell the farm, of course, because without Dad, there's no way we could run it. My mum and sister stayed in FNQ, and I packed my bags and toddled off down to Melbourne by myself. Miller to Melbourne, that was quite a culture shock, I can tell you.
More than one pub.
yeah.
And so how was medical school? Like, how did you find it, like, in relation, as you said, culture shock? And I guess looking back, what are some of the things that you remember or struggled with or, thoroughly enjoyed?
Looking back, I'm a bit ashamed at how I performed as a medical student. I was indifferent as a medical student in most respects. I had to keep reasonably good grades to keep my scholarship. It was an academic scholarship based on my my high school marks and stuff. So I had to do well enough to keep that scholarship, but I wasn't at all inspired by what we were taught in the first few years of medical school, nor was I inspired by what I was seeing around me in terms of what doctors did in at least in the tertiary hospitals in Melbourne where we were placed. And in retrospect, you're going to laugh. You're like, well, it was clear where you were heading, buddy. But at the time, all I knew is that I wanted to get the hell out of Melbourne. And so I applied for John Flynn's scholarship and went off to the Kimberley. Well, in fact, they tried to place me at some nice little tourist town in south coast of South Australia. I was like, no, thanks. I'm heading north. So off I went to Halls Creek for my John Flynn scholarship placement. I was like, bloody hell, this is real medicine, like what those guys were and presumably still are doing out there. And then, sort of later in our 6-year degree, when there was opportunities for rural placements, I did that, and, electives up in the top end and this kind of thing. My time in Halls Creek, compared to what my colleagues were doing in Melbourne, kind of gave me this bit of street cred, particularly around Indigenous health. So while I claimed absolutely no expertise in the topic, I had a bit more exposure to it than most of the rest of my classmates. So, I ended up getting involved in the Rural Health Club and organising lectures on Indigenous health. So again, in retrospect, kind of seems clear where I was heading. But at the time, rural generalist medicine was not a thing. It was not a term that I'd heard about. And ACRM was not an entity that I was aware of either. So it wasn't until I was kind of flushed out of the end of medical school, having taken a year off 2/3 of the way through, because I was so unconvinced that I was doing the right thing or that medicine for me. It wasn't until I got to the end and then went and did my internship in Perth and started to see other options out there. Like I went back up to the Kimberley under the PGPP placement. I'm sure you remember that. But it was a weird thing I did. It was like a public health RMO job through the pre-vocational general practice placements program. So how the hell they created that, I have no idea, but I'm glad they did, because I did that for 6 months and then did 6 months of ED in Alice Springs, thinking that I was choosing between emergency medicine and public health. They were the two main topics or disciplines or specialties that I was interested in. And it was only over the course of that, PGY2 year, rampaging around the Kimberley in the Central Australia, I was like, oh, I can have all this and more. And, I was hanging with rural generalist types, the registrars in the Kimberley, based in Broome, but we're doing, fly in, fly out clinics all around the Kimberley. And I was seeing what they were doing. I'm like, oh, that's radical. I'd love to do that. How do you do that? And you're like, oh, you join ACRM. I was like, what's ACRM? So I got there in the end.
Yeah. So what year did you start your registrar training?
So 2008 was when I was officially on the program. So I was in Alice Springs applying for ACRM. They took me on, and my first, I guess, registrar year, ACRM registrar job was in Cooktown in 2008. And that's when things really started to kind of crystallize for me that, okay, this is really what I want to do. It was gnarly. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us out there have experienced things like that, but, I was still pretty raw, fresh-faced PGY3, and all of a sudden I'm like on call at night, Cooktown Hospital, with all the wild stuff that comes through the door there, the heart attacks, and strokes, and tropical infections, and stabbings and stuff. But I loved it, and I was like, okay, this is my jam. This is what I want to do.
Yeah.
And so, I did my GP time as well, and learned a lot in that primary care environment in Cooktown, and later in Port Douglas and Mossman. But it was clear from that point that it was the rural hospital stuff that I really liked.
So is your advanced skill Aboriginal health or public health?
No, it's anesthetics, actually.
There you go.
Yeah, it was during that time in Cooktown that I had to figure out what I wanted to do with my AST, and considering I had a sort of a taste or a preference for the rural hospital medicine, I think it was pretty evident that I was likely to do something procedural from AST, and I dallied briefly with the idea of doing obstetrics, which terrified me. It still does, but I was like, well, one of those two would clearly be the most useful. And by the way, I also had a kind of vested interest, because I had decided by then that I wanted to go and work up in the Torres Strait. So I felt I had quite a glimpse of what Aboriginal health looked like in my time in the Kimberley and Central Australia, and the top end, and now Cape York. But the Torres Strait really, really fascinated me and appealed to me. So I think while I was in Cooktown, I phoned the med super of TI Hospital, Peter Arnold, not that time. Hi, Peter, if you're listening. And I think his wife Katrina was my mentor, and so I was like my sort of mentor with my ACRM training. So I spoke to both of them and said, listen, if I wanted to come up to the Torres Strait, how would I do that? And Peter's like, well, can you do a Caesar? I said, no. He's like, can you give it an anesthetic? I said, no. He's like, well, call me back when you do one of those things. So I spoke to Katrina about it, and we sort of considered what I was doing in Cooktown at the time, and realized that the anesthetics was, of the two, probably the most urgent and probably the most overall useful for where I was working and what I wanted to do. And given I didn't have any particular affection for O&G, decided on anesthetics, and it was the right decision for me.
Yeah.
So
I think
next year.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things, like with rural generalism, we talk about a lot of the advanced skills, but at the core, particularly in a town where there is a birthing service, you still need that core group of GP obstetricians or RG obstetricians and RG anaesthetists. And then once you fill all those jobs, then you can start to build the other advanced skill type RG roles. But at the core of it, you still need those two skills for a number of your doctors, which is interesting in, the workforce side of things. So you mentioned your mentors, your ACRM mentors. How important as a registrar is it to really connect with a mentor and have that backup support, do you think?
It's essential. I'd say the importance of that can't be overstated, because if you think about, who we are and what we do and where we work, like in Cooktown, for example, I don't mind sharing. Like, I was enjoying the work and knew and could see that I was learning and progressing, but I was lonely. It was socially isolated. I was the only registrar there at the time. Since then, Cooktown's been quite sexy and popular over the years, but I was alone. I had seniors around and supportive, although I was often kind of on call by myself and whatnot. But no, I felt really isolated. So having someone who was like committed to me and invested in me, and that I could ask for advice that I wasn't working with every day, was really helpful for me. And also just building up role models. By the way, Tash Coventry, was the boss of Cooktown Hospital then, still is, I believe. Hi,
Yep.
Tash, if you're listening. Legend of rural.
She was in our
medicine.
first series of the podcast, so we've talked to Tash
Awesome.
before.
No, love Tash. So she was a real inspiration to me. So there's mentors kind of in an official capacity, and then there's more informal mentors, who are just people that inspire you and support you, and to whom you can still turn to for advice and that kind of thing. But no, I think it's essential to have those kinds of people in your life, because we're not general surgical registrars. We're not surrounded by surgeons all day, every day, or apply to almost any other specialty. Our vocation, our work it can be pretty lonely at times. And so having those people that you can turn to and look up to, particularly when you're junior in training, but I think throughout your career, is not just helpful, it's vital.
So as you've gone on through your various jobs and careers, and I guess I had heard of you through the work you did, or a lot of work you did within the College of Rural and Remote Medicine, but I got to know you through your work in rocket ship. I guess your career has diverse, but how important is it to have those other interests other than the day-to-day job? And I guess what has brought you to those interests as well?
Well, I think that's a very individual perspective. Some people are perfectly happy, focusing on their clinical practice, and presumably their family if they had one, and whatever their other interests are. Everyone is entitled and should be encouraged to have their own interests. But in my case, I suppose from a pretty early stage, I had this sort of interest in the bigger picture perspective, whatever that was. So it would have been hard for me to articulate at the time, early on in my career, certainly not in medical school. But I was aware that I was interested in things beyond just fighting the good fight, one patient at a time. So doing that public health job up in the Kimberley, for example, I got interested in not just infectious diseases, but the determinants of infectious diseases. So, for example, Ross River virus, very highly influenced by temperature and rainfall, humidity. And so I started looking into some of those, what I would now refer to, what most people would refer to as determinants of health. And I got a little bit involved in research and this kind of thing. So by the time I got to sort of 2009, 2010, I was doing my AST year, anesthetics in Cairns, and then got my dream job up in the Torres Strait. I was starting to sort of get involved in some extracurricular activities. So I had started, and in fact, by that stage, almost finished a Master's in Public Health and Tropical Medicine. I served a term as Registrar Director on the ACRM board, and then later returned for another stint as Academic Director. So I was, very privileged, I felt, to be able to be involved with the college and kind of, peek behind the curtain as to how it was governed, how the training programs were implemented. And, I was mixing with very senior experienced colleagues who had been doing this a long time. And in fact, were among the founders of the whole discipline, but certainly of the college. So that then coupled with my interests in let's call it global health, sort of one thing led to another. So I was up in the Torres Strait as I was finishing my training by this stage, sitting my final exams. I was more involved in research. I was looking in particular at the causes of avoidable mortality in remote Indigenous communities, and why some in remote communities seem to perform better than others in terms of life expectancy and other health indicators. interested in that. I was working on that, got sent to the US to study that in DC for a couple of months. And so when I returned from that and finished my training, got my FACRA or working in the Torres Strait, my plan was then to go overseas and do something else. And that something else for a long time I had assumed would be Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, Doctors Without Borders. But when the time came to apply, when I was sitting on my couch on Thursday Island, I was sort of looking at really just whatever kind of global health jobs I could find. But I had this interest in public health, environmental health, and in particular climate change. That was really something that was sort of on my radar, that I was seeming to be reading about and hearing about. And I was like, why are a lot more people not concerned about this? This is a big deal. It's scary stuff. We don't seem to understand it very well, and we are certainly not prepared. In that surge, I came across this job with the World Health Organization, the South Pacific office, as the climate change and health officer. And I was like, okay, well, eureka, let's give that a go. And they gave me a go, which I was very surprised to discover. So that's what led to me working in the Pacific region. I was working on a regional project for WHO for a couple of years, looking at the health impacts of natural disasters and climate change in 12 different Pacific Island countries. Did my PhD on that topic while I was doing that, working with WHO. But two things were sort of in the background. One was that I was already connected to the Pacific, particularly through this adopted family that I have in Vanuatu, which is kind of a whole other crazy story. But I'd been coming and going to Vanuatu in particular for several years already, involved increasingly in some very small scale community development stuff, supporting this village called Bene Village on East Coast Santo, working with my adopted family to do really basic things, but that were also linked to determinants health. So we were, putting up solar panels and digging wells and establishing some micro enterprise ideas to generate some income for the village, set up a trust fund so that the kids, particularly the girls, could go to school. And so, I had this connection to Vanuatu, and then I had this job with WHO in the region. But I brought to those roles this experience not only of working as a rural generalist, but of being involved with ACRM and increasingly involved with the sort of the training side of things. So it was that combination of experiences and perspectives as I was roaming around the Pacific, meeting with all the ministers of health and directors and whoever, that I could see very clearly this problem of what we had been experiencing in Australia so many years earlier, of most of the population living in rural areas where the greatest health needs were, but most of the doctors being based in urban areas.
Yeah.
And so there was this, rural urban health differential, workforce maldistribution, and by the way, no training programs for doctors in the Pacific to become the equivalent of rural generalists. So that is, long story short, that's how Rocket Ship was born. Yeah.
And you're now in Geneva. So what's your current role?
Right. Well, I mean, it's a bit of a long story, but the short version is that I was still living in the Pacific. So after having finished my role with WHO, I was still doing consultancy work and whatever, but I'd finished my full-time role with WHO in the South Pacific office. Not long after that, I basically relocated to Vanuatu because the Ministry of Health asked me to set up their junior doctor training program, because Vanuatu, like many other Pacific Island countries, like many developing countries around the world, had sent a whole bunch of young people to Cuba to train as doctors with the Latin American School of Medicine. So Vanuatu had a doubling of their number of doctors overnight, but no plan to train the buggers. So I was living in Vanuatu, sort of setting up and running their intern program with a view to having an option for some of them, ideally many of them, to train as rural generalists once they'd completed their internship. And in parallel with Rocket Ship, we were setting up these family medicine programs, Fiji and Tonga, and we'd done something similar in East Timor. So all this was kind of happening. And, meanwhile, I was still associate professor at JCU by this time, and was still doing rural generalist work back in Australia. So had this sort of busy, interesting life, but I was on the move a lot. And involved in quite a lot of things. And then out of the blue, I got this call from colleagues at the headquarters of the World Health Organization here in Geneva to say, look, can you come and help us out for 6 months? And specifically to work on some climate change and health projects in a bunch of different countries. And initially I was a bit resistant. I was like, oh no, I'm pretty happy what I'm doing. Rocket ship's going well. I'm living in Vanuatu, working in rural hospitals in Australia, got this cool job training, Pacific Island doctors who have just been, graduated from Cuba. It was all very interesting. But then I thought, well, offers like that don't just fall from the sky every day. So I put things on hold and decamped to Geneva. It was supposed to be just for 6 months. And that's 6 years ago now. So met a girl, fell in love, and that kind of, was a bit of a spanner in the works of whatever vague plan I might have had. But what it did do, apart from, having that beautiful impact on my life in terms of finding my partner, was, and that it sort of gave me the trigger to look at other options in Geneva. And so I could see that I'd probably reached the end of the road with WHO, at least for that time. And so I went looking for other opportunities, and it was a very short look, because basically the only other thing I could think of was to see what they had going at the headquarters of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, which is also here in Geneva. So yeah, they had an interesting job going. I had also by this stage just completed my second round of specialty training as a public health physician, which I think probably helped getting this job at MSF headquarters. I was the medical advisor for infectious diseases, epidemics, and antimicrobial resistance. So, by this stage, I've been working for years in the health impacts and climate change, and now I'm getting into antimicrobial resistance. I must have had rocks in my head to be dealing with these colossal, complicated problems. But yeah, that was how I got my start in MSF. And then, they sent me to the field just to sort of check I had what it took. And I'm now, I've since changed roles within MSF, but I'm still with MSF. I'm now the Tropical Diseases and Planetary Health Advisor at MSF Operational Centre Geneva. But I'm still involved with ACRIM. I'm still a medical educator with the Independent Pathway, and I'm still a part-time rural generalist particularly with the virtual rural generalist service in Western New South Wales. So I'm still in the game, baby. I'm not haven't completely detached myself from the scene in Australia, and never intend to. Frankly, I'll keep it up as long as I can.
And you've written a book. What inspired you to do that?
Very nice of you to mention it, Peter. Yeah, it's coming out first week of September. So it's called Life and Death Decisions. What inspired me to do it? I was getting frustrated, quite honestly, with how few people and how little people in general seem to understand about some of these very, very serious problems that we're all facing, or that we are facing as a society. Things like Indigenous health inequities, the health impacts of climate change, the rise of drug-resistant infections. Of course, there are people who know about these things, people who understand them, people who are very worried about them. But it's that awareness is not nearly as widespread as it should be, and the commitment to addressing those problems is not nearly as strong as it ought to be. So, the experience of writing my PhD in particular, I was writing about some of those topics, but in a very sort of formal scientific way. So I was kind of worried about how few people really understood this topic, but also finding that I quite enjoyed the writing process.
Yeah.
So once I managed to escape from the sort of the rigid confines of my PhD program, I was starting to dabble a little bit more in kind of creative writing, poetry and whatever. And then particularly while I was in South Sudan in this civil war zone in a swamp as a pediatric doctor, again, another example of what rural generalists can do, right? From an MSF perspective, you can do just about anything. So off they sent me to this project that my boss described as the arse end of MSF. And as I was sitting there in my little mud hut at the end of the day, sitting on the floor, swatting mosquitoes, writing poetry by the light of a head torch after another day treating kids with cerebral malaria and dying of disseminated TB and whatever. I thought I was going to start write about those experiences, and that those initial scribblings with support of writers groups, and then ultimately agents and colleagues and friends who had written books and some increasingly sort of senior and influential literary figures kind of got me to the point where I actually had a whole book. yeah, I'm thrilled to be sitting here chatting to you with that book coming out in the next couple of weeks. So it's kind of part medical memoir, part call to arms for action on some of these, very significant but largely neglected global health problems. But it is written, if you forgive me a moment of immodesty, it's written in a sufficiently entertaining and engaging way that the strategy with this book is that it's kind of enough of a page turner that people will read the book and hopefully enjoy the book, and these messages will be inserted into their brains, kind of almost.
We wouldn't have expected anything less, Lockie.
Yeah. So yeah, I look forward to people being able to read it and going on to read it, and I'm sure that many rural generalists out there will be like, oh yeah, and he's just talking about what we do every day, and that's kind of the idea. I really wanted to give rural generalist medicine a bit of the limelight, because I think what we do is amazing. What we all do professionally, I mean, is amazing, and probably don't get enough bloody credit for it. And then there's also this kind of element that I wanted to highlight, at least from my own personal experience, that okay, we work hard and do some pretty wild stuff, but we're also human. We're flawed. We make mistakes. We're vulnerable. We're not superhuman. We're not. It's not all bloody beer and Skittles, right? And so some of the dark sides of being a doctor and being a rural generalist, including working in rural and remote communities and some pretty sketchy parts of the world, all that's in there as well. I want people to be able to get a glimpse of the work and the life, warts and all.
I think I know what you're going to say to this, but I mean, a lot of medical students or junior doctors sometimes look at rural medicine and think it's, by going rural, it's career limiting. If anything, I mean, I guess I know what you say, but what would you say to them?
That's factually inaccurate, Peter.
well, I think you're like Exhibit A. You're like Exhibit A. No, it doesn't happen. So we're coming to the end of our time, and I really appreciate you talking to us. And it's an amazing story, and we're really proud to support you and promote your book and support your book, because I think it does put rural generalism in the spotlight. And I think, telling all sides of rural generalist medicine, nice, is an important part. It's not all, as you said, it's not all rainbows and, the hero saving the day. There's tough elements to rural medicine, and, it's important that all aspects are understood, but also how rewarding it can be. I do like to finish sort of up with a bit of a quick fire round of questions. So just the first answer that pops in to your head.
Hit me.
Okay. All right. Favourite holiday spot?
Vanuatu.
Okay. Here's one. The best book. Your favourite book. Not yours.
Damn it. I'm a big fan of David Mitchell. I think he's one of our greatest living sort of literary figures. So yeah, people haven't heard of David Mitchell, haven't read any stuff, start with The Thousand Autumns of Jacob Desert. It's a wild ride. Okay.
All right. Rural generalism, medical administration, public health, or medical education?
What do I only have to choose one to do the rest of my life?
Oh, you can do two. The two best bits.
I mean, I'm a rural generalist and public health physician, so they're my two main jams.
Fair enough. Okay. Best piece of advice you've ever received?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd say it's something along the lines of don't give up your interests and your passions. And I say this a lot to junior colleagues, medical students, and whatever. Keep up your hobbies. Medicine it's a bit of a dangerous profession in a way, because it's hard work, and generally speaking, I think it suppresses creativity. A lot of things are beaten out of us in medical school and earlier on in our careers. And a lot of people who do medicine are very intelligent, interesting, skilled people. So keep up your hobbies, keep playing the piano and like playing tennis or doing interpretive dance or whatever you're into, because if you give it up for medicine, you probably regret it.
Yeah. Lockie, on that note, we will finish, and thank you so much, and I wish you all the best. Look forward to catching up with you soon for a beer, and thank you for joining us on this podcast.
Likewise, been an absolute pleasure, Peter. Hi to everyone, and keep up the great work. And it's a privilege to be part of this community. Thanks a million.